In order for us to do this, let's very quickly just go through the life of St. Anthony to make sure that first we honor him, and that secondly, that we have a proper understanding of who it is that we are speaking about. So we know that he is born halfway through the third century, in the year approximately 251 AD. There is some questioning of whether or not he was born 251, 252, 253. Regardless, we are going to assume that the Coptic tradition is right and it's 251 AD. And he was born in Egypt in a small area of Beni Suef called Kibn Larus. He was born to very, very rich parents, and his parents were extremely wealthy because they owned an extreme amount of farmland. He owned almost approximately 300 acres of farmland, who at that time was an extreme amount of prosperity, and that his family was recognized to be wealthy because they owned all of this land that was very plenteous and very fruitful and profitable to them. His parents died when he was still very young. We're talking of approximately between the ages of 18 to 20 years old. They died one after the other, and when he found himself in a situation where both his parents had now passed away, and he was left in the care of his sister, he now is faced to be able to contemplate on what it means for him to be able to follow the Lord. And so we know the story of about how it is that he enters into the church and he hears the reading of the Gospel of St. Matthew that talks about, if you desire to be perfect, go sell all that you have, give to the poor, come carry your cross and follow me and be my disciple. And so he contemplates this. What does it mean for him to give everything up? He decides ultimately to give up his inheritance and to sell the land that was left to him by his parents, to take a portion of that to leave it for his sister, in order for his younger sister to be able to take care of herself under the care of some solitary and ascetic women. And then he goes on and he pursues his own life of trying to be a solitary on the outskirts of the city. So he learns virtue from these elders that were living on the outskirts of the city. And many of us sometimes think that the first movement of asceticism was actually established by Saint Anthony, but in reality that's not true. There was already people who were living dedicated to God by the time that Saint Anthony was not even 20 years old. But they were living on the outskirts of the city. The movement into the desert had not yet happened, but they were living a solitary life on the outskirts of the city, trying to contemplate the gospel, living in union as best as they can with the Lord. And so he went and lived with these ascetic men, and he learned from every single one of them as many virtues as he possibly could. He then finally, when he felt like he had plateaued and learned everything he could from them, he moved into the catacombs, further alone, out into the desert. Now, the catacombs, for those of you who need context, people would not bury their dead within the city. For hygienic reasons, they always thought it would be best for them to be able to bury their dead further into the desert. And so the catacombs were oftentimes found, especially in Egypt in the very dry lands, further out into the deserts. And so he went and lived in those catacombs, in those burial places of the dead, to be able to have that much more isolation. And so he moves into the catacombs further alone. We're going to hear about all of the temptations and the warfares that he underwent when he lived on his own in solitude. And then he decides that's not even further deep enough. He moves further into the inner desert, and he lives in solitude for approximately 20 years further into the desert. His popularity grows, and by this point, everyone begins to hear of this great solitary called Anthony, who was from the land of Egypt, but he lives now in the desert all by himself. And as his popularity grows, he begins to have disciples. And now he's approximately in his 60s. At some point, we know that the uprising of persecution against Christians happens under Diocletian, and St. Anthony desires to give his life up to God. And so he leaves his solitary life, goes back into the city, and he desires martyrdom. He desires to die among the ranks of those who offer their lives to the King of Glory. But instead, the Lord had different plans for him, and so he was never killed, even though he tried to actually provoke the governors and the soldiers to be able to put him to death. He never actually received the crown of martyrdom, and it is clear that the Lord desired for him to be a great Abba, to disciple an entire generation of monastics. And now we know that centuries and centuries and thousands of years after his death, he's still considered the great Abba, the teacher of so many. And so the Lord used him as a living icon of what it means to be a martyr who is still alive. We know that a little bit later there is the Edict of Milan at the turning point of the fourth century. And so here under Constantine, there is the beginning of this movement of people finding a little bit more freedom in being able to express their Christian life across the empire and especially in Egypt. And so when people found that they could no longer offer their lives in the form of martyrdom, they decided to offer their lives differently in the form of monastic life, solitary life. And so they then follow Anthony into the desert. He decides at this point that nope, I'm not interested in the crowd. So he goes further into the deep eastern desert of Egypt. The people still followed him regardless. He disciples and he inspires so many. And we know this because we know that his contemporaries, Abba Macarius, Abba Didymus, even St. Athanasius the Apostolic, the great patriarch of Alexandria, was one of his disciples. He ends up dying at the good old age of 105 years old, and he refuses to be honored by his disciples. He does not want his body to be public. He asks the Lord to be able to hide his body so that he is not revered in any way or honored in any way. He'd rather be unknown. But we know that the Lord had greater plans for the great Abba Anthony. So let's talk about the victories in his life. This is just obviously a very brief summary of his life. It is deserving of much more contemplation. Today, our focus is going to be really to focus on certain aspects of victories in the life of St. Anthony so that you and I could be inspired from his life.